in the heart of a mist-shrouded village, where the air hums faintly with the whispers of ancient spells, an elderly enchanter named Alowen works by the flickering glow of a single candle. Her hands, weathered by time and countless incantations, tremble as she stirs a potion in a small, worn cauldron. The room is thick with the scent of herbs and the weight of urgency. Elowen feels it a disturbance in the magical weave, a ripple that grows stronger with each passing moment. Something is unraveling the very threads of enchantment, and she knows the danger it poses. Her mission is clear: find the source of this disruption before it consumes all magic. But time is slipping away, and the stakes are far greater than anyone could imagine. The faint hum of a distant spell lingers in the air, a warning of the peril to come. What secrets lie hidden in the shadows of this mystical world, and can Alowen uncover them before it's too late? The faint glow of Alowen's staff pulsed softly as she stepped deeper into the whispering woods, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient secrets. The trail of fading magic shimmered like a faint thread, pulling her forward, though every step seemed to echo with the weight of the forest's unease. It was here, in this quiet, shadowed grove, that she found it, a wounded forest spirit, its ethereal form flickering like a candle on the brink of going out. Its once vivid light now dimmed, casting eerie shadows across the moss-covered ground. The spirit's voice, though fragile, carried a sense of urgency as it spoke of a shadowy figure, a thief of magic, draining the lifeblood of the land itself. Elowen's heart clenched as she knelt beside the spirit, her fingers brushing against its wavering form. She could feel the toll the theft had taken, the essence of the forest slipping away like sand through an hourglass. The spirit's plea hung in the air, a silent question. Would she use her own magic to heal it, even if it meant depleting her already dwindling reserves? The choice weighed heavily on her, but there was no hesitation in her decision. With a deep breath, she summoned the last vestiges of her power, her hands glowing as she poured her energy into the spirit. The act left her weakened, her staff dimming as the forest spirit's light flickered back to life, though faintly. Before fading into the shadows, the spirit leaned close, its voice a mere whisper. "Seek the mirror of echoes," it said, the words lingering like a haunting melody. Elowen's mind raced as she absorbed the cryptic clue, her resolve solidifying with each passing moment. The woods around her seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in as if the forest itself were holding its breath. But Alowen pressed on, her determination unwavering, even as the weight of her choice settled heavily on her shoulders. The air grew colder, the path ahead uncertain, but her steps never faltered. The whispering woods had given her a warning, and now they seemed to watch her every move, waiting to see if she could rise to the challenge. The air grew heavy as Alowen stepped into the ruins of the ancient temple, her boots crunching softly against the moss-covered stone. The scent of damp earth and ancient stone filled her lungs, mingling with the faint, almost imperceptible hum of magic that seemed to cling to the air like a lingering whisper. She paused for a moment, her hand brushing against the crumbling walls, feeling the faint pulse of energy that still coursed through the temple's veins. It was as if the very stones remembered their purpose, waiting for someone like her to awaken them once more. Before her, The path split into three, each corridor lined with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light. Elowen's eyes narrowed as she studied them, her mind racing to decipher the patterns. The first puzzle was a test of knowledge, a series of runes that glowed faintly as she traced them with her fingers. Each rune represented an element of magic, and she had to align them in the correct order, a task that required both memory and intuition. Her heart quickened as the final rune clicked into place, and the ground beneath her feet rumbled, revealing a hidden passage deeper into the temple. The next challenge awaited her in a circular chamber, its walls adorned with shimmering mosaics that depicted the history of magic. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a sphere of swirling light. Elowen approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. The sphere pulsed, and a voice, soft yet commanding, echoed in her mind. "Prove your worth," it said. She closed her eyes, focusing on the flow of energy around her. With a steady hand, she channeled a thread of her own magic into the sphere, weaving it into the intricate patterns of the mosaics. The room filled with a soft, golden light, and the path forward cleared. As she stepped into the inner sanctum, the air grew colder, the hum of magic now a low, almost menacing drone. There, resting on an altar of obsidian, was the Mirror of Echoes. Its surface was dark and reflective, yet it seemed to hold a depth that went beyond mere glass. Alowen reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the cool metal frame. But before she could grasp it, a shadowy figure stepped from the darkness, their form cloaked in swirling tendrils of black mist. "You waste your time," the figure sneered, their voice dripping with disdain. "Magic is a relic of the past, a dying art that has no place in this world. Why cling to something so obsolete?" Elowen's breath hitched, the words striking a nerve she hadn't realized was so raw. Doubt crept into her mind, a whisper that threatened to unravel her resolve. But she straightened her back, her grip tightening on her staff. "Magic is not just power," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "It's life, it's connection, and I won't let you, or anyone diminish that." The mirror began to glow, its surface rippling like water as a vision unfolded before her. A mountain loomed in the distance, its peak shrouded in storm clouds that crackled with lightning. The image was fleeting, but it burned itself into her mind, a beacon calling her forward. The shadowy figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the chamber. "Foolish girl," they said, their form dissolving into the darkness. "You'll see soon enough." Alowen stood alone, the mirror now cradled in her hands. Its glow faded, leaving only the faintest trace of warmth against her skin. She took a deep breath, the weight of the vision settling over her like a mantle. The mountain awaited, and with it, the answers she sought. But more than that, it was a chance to prove, to herself and to the world, that magic was not just a relic of the past. It was a force of the present, and perhaps the future. The journey to Stormpeak Mountain was no easy feat, but Alowen pressed forward, the enchanted mirror in her hand, glowing faintly as it guided her through the rugged terrain. The air grew colder with each step, and the wind carried whispers of something ancient, something waiting. It was here, amidst the jagged cliffs and swirling mists, that she first spotted Kael, a young wanderer huddled beneath a worn cloak, his eyes sharp but guarded. He had seen the shadowy figure, he claimed, though his tone was laced with bitterness. Magic, he said, had failed him once before, and he had no reason to trust it, or anyone who wielded it. His skepticism was palpable, a stark contrast to Elowen's unwavering belief in the power she carried. Yet, there was something in his story, a flicker of vulnerability, that made her pause. Could he be a hindrance, or might he hold a key to unraveling the mystery of the shadowy figure? Despite her doubts, Alowen chose to bring Kael along. She saw in him not just a reluctant companion, but a chance to reignite the spark of wonder that tragedy had extinguished. The climb grew steeper, the path more treacherous, and the tension between them simmered beneath the surface. Kael's cynicism clashed with Elowen's optimism, each step forward a silent battle of wills. Then, without warning, the mountain roared to life, a deafening avalanche crashing down, forcing them to scramble for safety. They found refuge in a nearby cave, its walls damp and echoing with the sound of dripping water. As they caught their breath, the faint light of the mirror revealed something extraordinary. Ancient carvings etched into the stone, their lines and symbols telling a story older than memory. The carvings depicted a figure cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and elusive, surrounded by symbols of light and darkness, locked in an eternal struggle. Elowen traced the lines with her fingers, her heart racing as the pieces began to fall into place. Kael, however, stood back, his arms crossed. More stories, he muttered, his voice heavy with disbelief. What good will this do us? The tension between them thickened, a quiet storm brewing in the depths of the cave. Elowen's hope and Kael's doubt were like two opposing forces, each testing the other's resolve. Yet, in that moment, something shifted. The carvings weren't just a tale of the past. They were a warning, a clue to the shadowy figure's true nature. And as the weight of that realization settled over them, the question lingered. Could they bridge the divide between their worlds, or would their differences tear them apart before they reached the mountain's peak? The dim glow of Elowen's lantern flickered against the ancient carvings etched into the cave walls. Her fingers traced the intricate symbols, each one telling a story far older than either of them could fathom. These carvings, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. They speak of an enchanter, once revered, who sought to harness all magic for themselves. But their ambition, it consumed them, twisted them. Kael stood a few steps behind, arms crossed, his usual skepticism etched into his expression. Yet as Elowen's words hung in the air, he couldn't help but feel a prickling unease. The shadowy figure they'd encountered, could it truly be this fallen enchanter, now a hollow echo of their former self, driven to madness by the very power they sought to control? Before Kael could voice his doubts, a low growl echoed through the cavern. From the darkness emerged shadowy creatures, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke given life. Elowen's hands shot up, a faint shimmer of magic forming around her fingers, but the creatures moved faster than she could react. Kael, without thinking, stepped forward. His movements were instinctive, almost primal, as he reached out and spoke words he didn't even realize he knew. A surge of energy burst from his hands, sending the creatures reeling. Elowen stared at him wide-eyed. "Kael, you're an enchanter," He looked down at his hands, as surprised as she was. I didn't know. I didn't think I could." The creatures regrouped, their whispers filling the air, low and insidious. "Doubt, fear, weakness," they hissed, their voices weaving into Kael's thoughts. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog, but the words lingered, planting seeds of uncertainty. Elowen, sensing his struggle, placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Don't listen to them. They feed on fear. Stay with me." Together, they fought, their movements growing more synchronized with every strike. The bond between them, once tentative, now felt unshakable. But as the last shadow creature dissolved into nothingness, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. Outside, the storm raged with newfound fury, the wind howling like a living thing. The cave, once a place of refuge, now felt like a fragile barrier against the chaos beyond. Elowen turned to Kael, her expression a mix of determination and concern. "We're close. I can feel it, but the closer we get, the more dangerous this becomes." "That enchanter there trying to stop us?" Kael nodded, his jaw tightening. The whispers still echoed in his mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Yet as the storm roared outside, he couldn't help but wonder, was the real danger out there, or was it something growing within him? The air grew thin as Alowen and Kael ascended the final stretch of Stormpeak Mountain, their breaths visible in the frosty air. The path ahead was treacherous, jagged rocks and icy winds, testing their resolve. But as they reached the summit, the sight before them stopped them in their tracks. A crumbling tower loomed ahead, its ancient stones barely holding together. From within, a dark energy pulsed, like a heartbeat that seemed to echo in their very bones. It was alive, malevolent, and waiting. Standing at the tower's entrance was the shadowy figure, its form shifting and indistinct, as though it were made of the very darkness it commanded. Its voice slithered into their minds, cold and mocking, painting vivid images of a world stripped of magic. A world where enchanters like Alowen were forgotten, their craft dismissed as mere myth. The visions were sharp, cutting deep into her insecurities, her fear of failure, of becoming irrelevant in a world that no longer believed in what she could do. Beside her, Kael clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He had always been the skeptic, the one who questioned the unseen, but now even he couldn't deny the raw, oppressive force before them. The figure fed on their doubt, growing stronger with every flicker of uncertainty. Alowen could feel it, a parasitic pull that threatened to unravel her confidence. She turned to Kael, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "It's not just magic it's after," she said. "It's our belief, our hope. Without those, it wins." Kael nodded, his usual sarcasm replaced by a grim determination. "So we don't give it what it wants. Easier said than done, though." He glanced at the mirror of echoes, the artifact they had carried all this way. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting not their faces, but the faintest glimmer of light amidst the surrounding darkness. "This thing, it's not just a mirror, is it? It's a weapon." Elowen's eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw not just the skeptic, but the ally he had become. "It reflects what's inside," she explained. "Not just light, but truth. If we can turn its own darkness against it, She trailed off, the plan forming in her mind even as she spoke. The figure laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "You think your trinkets can stop me?" it sneered. "Your magic is fading, Enchanter, just like your kind." Alowen stepped forward, her staff glowing faintly in her hands. "You're wrong," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't fully feel. "Magic isn't just spells and artifacts. It's belief, and I believe in what I can do." She glanced back at Kael, a silent signal passing between them. He nodded, gripping the mirror tightly as he began to move to the side, staying out of the figure's direct line of sight. The tension in the air was electric, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Elowen took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was it, the moment she had to face not just the shadowy figure, but her own fears. She raised her staff, the light at its tip flickering like a fragile flame in the wind. "You want fear," she called out, her voice steady. "Then come and take it." The figure lunged, its form shifting like a storm unleashed. Elowen met it head-on, her magic flaring as she parried its attacks. Each strike was a test, not just of her skill, but of her resolve. Behind her, Kael moved quickly, positioning himself to strike. The mirror of echoes hummed in his hands, its surface clouding with the same dark energy that radiated from the figure. He waited, his heart pounding, for the right moment, the moment when the figure's own power could be turned against it. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Alowen felt a spark of hope. They weren't just fighting for magic, they were fighting for the belief that it could exist, that it could thrive, and as long as that belief burned, even faintly, they had a chance. The air inside the tower crackled with tension as Alowen raised her hands, her voice steady but strained as she chanted an ancient incantation. Threads of light spiraled from her fingertips, weaving a shimmering barrier between them and the shadowy figure. But the figure only laughed a cold, echoing sound that seemed to seep into the very stones of the tower. Each step it took sent ripples through Alowen's spell, the light flickering like a dying flame. Kael crouched beside the mirror, his fingers trembling as he tried to recall the precise sequence of symbols. The figure's voice cut through the chaos, taunting him, feeding on his doubt. "You think you can control what you don't understand," it sneered, its form flickering like smoke. Alowen's spells grew weaker, her strength fading with every passing moment. The barrier wavered, then shattered, and she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The figure loomed closer, its shadow stretching across the room, and for a moment, Kael froze. He could feel the weight of his own fear pressing down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. But then, like a whisper on the wind, the forest spirit's words returned to him. "Magic is not about control," it had said. "It is about belief." With a deep breath, Kael closed his eyes and let go of the doubt that had held him back for so long. He placed his hands on the mirror, and this time, there was no hesitation. The symbols beneath his fingers began to glow, brighter and brighter, until the entire room was bathed in light. The figure recoiled, its mocking laughter turning to a scream as the mirror's power engulfed it. The light was blinding, pure, and for a moment, it seemed as though the world itself had stopped. Then the tower began to shake, stones crumbling from the ceiling. Kael grabbed Alowen's hand and pulled her to her feet. the two of them stumbling toward the doorway as the floor cracked beneath them. Behind them, the mirror's light pulsed, and the figure's shadow dissolved into nothingness. They burst out into the storm just as the tower collapsed, the sound of falling stones drowned out by the howling wind. But as they ran, something began to change. The storm clouds above them parted, and a single beam of sunlight broke through. The rain slowed, then stopped, and the land around them seemed to sigh with relief. The trees, once twisted and dark, straightened, their leaves turning vibrant green. The air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Kael and Alowen stood there, breathless, watching as the forest came back to life around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kael felt a flicker of hope. The magic he had doubted, the power he had feared, had saved them. And as the sunlight warmed his face, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand what it truly meant to believe. As Elowen and Kael made their way back to the village, the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. The villagers, who had once whispered doubts about the young apprentice and his enigmatic mentor, now poured into the streets, their faces alight with joy and relief. Cheers rang out, and the sound of laughter mingled with the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. It was a moment of triumph, a rare pause in the relentless march of time, where the weight of their struggles lifted, if only for a little while. Elowen, though visibly wearied, stood tall, her presence radiating a quiet strength that had been absent for too long. Her magic, once flickering like a dying flame, now burned steady and bright again. But even as the villagers celebrated, Elowen felt the subtle pull of something deeper, something inevitable. She knew her time, as the village's enchanter was drawing to a close. The battles she had fought, the knowledge she had gathered, and the sacrifices she had made, they were all threads in a tapestry that would soon be passed to another. And so, with a quiet resolve, she turned to Kael, the young man who had once questioned every spell, every ritual, now stood before her with a newfound sense of purpose. The skepticism that had once clouded his eyes had been replaced by a quiet determination, a spark of understanding that had been kindled in the heat of their shared trials. Their days became a rhythm of teaching and learning. Alowen guided Kael through the intricate dance of magic, showing him how to weave spells with precision and patience. She shared stories of her own mistakes, her own moments of doubt, and the lessons she had learned the hard way. Kael listened intently, his hands steady as he practiced the ancient incantations, his voice growing more confident with each passing day. There was a beauty in this exchange, a passing of the torch that neither of them could fully articulate. The bond between them deepened, not just as mentor and apprentice, but as kindred spirits united by a shared destiny. Yet, even as the village flourished under their combined efforts, Elowen couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was fragile. In the quiet moments, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the world seemed to hold its breath, she would glance toward the distant hills. There, in the shadows, something stirred a faint, almost imperceptible ripple in the fabric of the world. She didn't speak of it to Kael, not yet, but she knew that the challenges they had faced were only the beginning. The world beyond their village was vast and unpredictable, and the forces they had battled were but fragments of a larger, more ominous truth. For now, though, the village thrived, its people basking in the warmth of their hard-won victory. Elowen allowed herself a rare smile as she watched Kael practice his craft, his movements growing more fluid, his confidence undeniable. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also brimming with possibility. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Alowen felt a quiet sense of pride. She had done her part. The rest would be up to Kael. Kael stood at the edge of the Whispering Woods, the weight of Alowen's legacy pressing heavily on his shoulders. The responsibilities of being the Last Enchanter felt like a storm cloud looming over him, dark and unrelenting. He had hoped to find solace or perhaps some semblance of guidance from the forest spirit, a being whispered about in hushed tones by the villagers. But as he stepped deeper into the woods, the air grew eerily still. The spirit was nowhere to be found. The once vibrant grove now felt hollow, as if it had lost its voice. As he wandered further, his boot caught on something beneath the soil, a faint glimmer in the earth. Kneeling, Kael brushed away the dirt to reveal a small, glowing seed. It pulsed softly, a rhythm that matched the beat of his own heart. The energy radiating from it was unmistakable, a warmth that felt both foreign and familiar. It was as if the seed held a piece of the forest's soul, a fragment of the magic that had once thrived here. His fingers trembled as he held it, the weight of his decision pressing in. Should he plant it, risking whatever unknown power it might unleash, or leave it buried, preserving the fragile balance of the present? The choice gnawed at him, each option carrying its own consequences. But as he gazed at the lifeless trees around him, their branches brittle and bare, he knew inaction was no longer an option. With a deep breath, Kael pressed the seed into the soil, his hands trembling as he whispered a quiet plea to the forest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground beneath him began to hum, a low, resonant vibration that spread through the earth. The seed sprouted, its roots weaving into the soil with astonishing speed. A sapling emerged, its bark shimmering with an otherworldly light, and its branches stretched upward as if reaching for the sky. The forest around him stirred, a gentle rustle of leaves that hadn't been heard in years. The air grew warmer, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers. It was as if the woods were awakening from a long, deep slumber, their magic rekindled by the seed's power. Kael watched in awe as the new tree grew taller, its leaves glowing faintly in the dim light. He felt a surge of hope, a spark of something he hadn't felt since Elowen's passing. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, a chance to restore what had been lost. But as the forest came alive around him, a part of him wondered what else the seed might awaken, and whether he was truly ready for what lay ahead. The towering tree stretched skyward, its branches unfurling like the arms of an ancient guardian. In mere days, its roots had woven themselves deep into the earth, threading through the soil with a life of their own. Kael could feel the pulse of its energy, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo in his very bones. What he hadn't anticipated was the way the tree seemed to tap into the magical weave itself, amplifying the flow of enchantment across the land. It was as though the tree had become a living conduit, drawing power from the very heart of magic. But there was something else, too, something darker. Every time Kael reached out to the tree's energy, he caught a faint whisper, a shadow lingering at the edges of his awareness. It felt familiar, like the presence he'd sensed before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kael confided in Alowen. Her expression grew solemn as he described the shadowy figure he'd glimpsed within the tree's aura. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of memories. That presence, it's someone I once knew, someone I trusted. They were my mentor long ago, a brilliant enchanter, but their ambition consumed them. They sought power beyond their grasp, and in doing so, they became something else. Kael's breath caught in his throat. The idea that such a figure had once stood where he now stood, wielding the same magic, was both humbling and unsettling. He felt a pang of unease, a flicker of doubt about his own path. But Alowen's gaze was steady, her words firm. You are not them, Kael. Their choices do not define yours. Learn from their mistakes, but do not let their shadow dim your light. Her reassurance steadied him, and he nodded, resolve hardening within him. He would not let fear dictate his journey. As the tree continued to grow, its presence began to ripple outward, drawing the attention of others. Magical beings from distant corners of the land emerged, some curious, others cautious. A group of forest spirits approached one morning, their forms shimmering like morning dew, their voices a melodic hum. They spoke of balance, of the tree's power, and its potential to disrupt the natural order. Kael listened intently, his respect for their wisdom evident, but not all who came were so benevolent. A nomadic tribe of enchanters, their eyes sharp with suspicion, arrived soon after. They questioned Kael's motives, their distrust palpable. Power like this is not meant to be wielded by one, their leader said, his tone edged with warning. The stakes had never been higher. Kael found himself standing at the center of a delicate web of alliances and tensions. Each decision he made carried weight, each action rippling through the fragile balance of the magical world. He knew he couldn't do this alone. Turning to Elowen, he sought her guidance once more, her wisdom a beacon in the growing storm. Together, they began to navigate this new landscape, forging connections where they could, and bracing for the challenges that lay ahead. The tree, still growing, still humming with power, stood as both a symbol of hope and a harbinger of trials yet to come. The air grew heavy with tension as a group of rogue enchanters emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with a hunger for power. These were no ordinary wanderers. Their intentions were clear as they approached the ancient tree, drawn by whispers of its boundless magic. Kael stood firm, his heart pounding, knowing he had to find a way to reason with them. Elowen's voice echoed in his mind, urging caution, her wisdom a steadying force. But Kael, still new to the weight of leadership, struggled to balance diplomacy with the need to protect the tree. His words were earnest, his tone measured, but the rogue enchanters only smirked, their patience wearing thin. The situation escalated quickly. One of the enchanters stepped forward, his voice laced with mockery as he dismissed Kael's pleas. You think you can stop us? Boy, this power belongs to those strong enough to wield it. Kael's inexperience showed in the way he hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for his staff. But when the first spell was cast, a burst of searing light aimed at the tree. Something inside him snapped. The tree's energy surged through him, a torrent of raw magic that filled his veins with an intensity he had never known. In that moment, instinct took over. Kael raised his staff, and the air crackled as he unleashed a spell of unimaginable force. A wave of energy that sent the rogue enchanters stumbling back. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. The rogue enchanters retreated, their faces twisted with fury and defeat, but their parting words hung in the air like a storm cloud. This isn't over. We'll be back, and next time, you won't be so lucky. Kael stood amidst the aftermath, his chest heaving, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. The tree's magic had saved them, but at what cost? He could feel its power still coursing through him, a reminder that such strength came with a price. Alowen approached, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You did what you had to do," she said softly, "but remember, power like this is not just a tool, it's a responsibility." Kael nodded, his mind racing. The victory felt hollow, a fleeting moment of triumph, overshadowed by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The rogue enchanters would return, and next time, they would come prepared. The ancient tree, once a symbol of hope and wonder, now felt like a beacon drawing danger closer. Kael's hands tightened around his staff as he resolved to grow stronger, to master the magic that had both saved and burdened him. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The tree's power was both a blessing and a curse, and Kael would have to learn to wield it wisely if he hoped to protect all that he held dear. Kael stood before the ancient tree, its roots sprawling deep into the earth like veins of the forest itself. The air around him hummed with an almost electric energy, as if the tree were alive and watching, waiting for him to prove himself. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and pressed his palm against the rough bark. A surge of power shot through him, wild and untamed, like a river breaking its banks. He gasped, trying to steady his breathing, to channel the energy without letting it consume him. It was a delicate dance. One wrong step, and the magic could spiral out of control, leaving him vulnerable to forces he didn't fully understand. Elowen stood a few paces back, her eyes sharp and watchful. Pride flickered in her gaze, but it was tempered by something darker. Concern. "You're learning quickly," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But remember, Kael, this power isn't just a tool. It's a responsibility. Rely too much on it, and it will start to rely on you. There's a fine line between control and dependence." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with warning. Kael nodded, but he could already feel the pull, the way the tree's energy seemed to whisper promises of strength, of answers, of something more. And then there were the other whispers. At first, they were faint, almost like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more insistent. They didn't come from the tree, not exactly. They felt foreign, like an echo from somewhere far away. Kael tried to ignore them, to focus on his training, but the whispers began to seep into his thoughts, blurring the line between his own mind and the voice of the shadowy figure. It was as if the figure were reaching out, testing the edges of his consciousness, probing for a way in. Alowen noticed the change in him, the way his eyes would dart nervously, the way he sometimes seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she approached him with a solemn expression. "There's a way to sever the connection," she said quietly. "A ritual that can cut the ties between you and the tree, between you and whatever is speaking to you, but it comes at a cost." Her voice wavered slightly, and Kael felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of cost?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Alowen hesitated, then spoke. "The ritual requires a great sacrifice. To sever the bond, you would have to give up a part of your own magic. Not just a little, but enough to weaken you, perhaps permanently. It's a risk, Kael. A risk to your power, to your identity, to everything you've worked for." Kael's chest tightened. The thought of losing his magic, the very thing that defined him, was almost too much to bear. But the alternative, allowing the shadowy figure to grow stronger, to take control, was unthinkable. He felt torn, caught between his duty to protect the tree and the forest, and his fear of losing himself in the process. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more urgent, as if they could sense his indecision. As the days turned into nights, the tension within him reached a breaking point. Every moment of training, every attempt to connect with the tree, felt like a battle not just against the magic, but against the shadowy presence that threatened to consume him. He knew he couldn't delay the decision much longer. The forest depended on him, but so did his own soul, and somewhere, deep down, he wondered if the two could ever truly be aligned. Kael stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached out to the ancient tree. The air around him seemed to hum with a low, resonant energy, each vibration echoing through his bones. This was the moment he had prepared for, the moment he had feared. Drawing in a deep breath, he began the ritual, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within him. The words of power spilled from his lips, weaving a delicate thread of magic that connected him to the tree's immense energy. But as the connection deepened, so did the pain. It was as if the tree's power was a wildfire, consuming everything in its path, and Kael was standing in the heart of the flames. The agony was unbearable. Every fiber of his being screamed for release, but he held on, determined to see this through. The tree's energy pulsed through him, threatening to overwhelm his senses. He could feel himself slipping, his consciousness fraying at the edges as the tree's whispers grew louder, more insistent. They promised power, knowledge, even peace, but at a cost he wasn't willing to pay. Just as he felt himself being pulled under, a familiar warmth brushed against his mind. Elowen, she was there, her presence a lifeline in the chaos. With what little strength she had left, she anchored him, her magic wrapping around his like a shield. Her voice, faint but steady, whispered in his ear, "Stay with me, Kael, you're not alone." Her intervention was enough. With a final surge of willpower, Kael severed the connection, the force of it sending a shockwave through the clearing. The tree's energy, now untethered, began to spiral out of control. Its roots trembled, and the ground beneath them cracked and shifted. Kael knew he couldn't stop now. If the tree's energy wasn't stabilized, it would destroy everything in its path. Summoning the last reserves of his magic, he knelt and pressed his hands into the earth, channeling his own energy into the tree's roots. It was a delicate balance, like trying to calm a raging river with only his hands. Sweat dripped from his brow as he worked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Slowly, painfully, the tree's energy began to settle, the chaotic vibrations fading into a low, steady hum. The whispers ceased, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Kael collapsed to his knees, utterly spent. His body felt like it had been hollowed out, every ounce of strength drained from him. But as he looked up, he saw Alowen fall, her body crumpling to the ground. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. He crawled to her side, his heart aching with guilt and sorrow. She had given everything to save him, to save them all. Cradling her in his arms, he whispered words of gratitude and regret, knowing that her sacrifice had come at a cost he could never repay. In that moment, Kael vowed to honor her, to carry her legacy forward. The battle might have been won, but the weight of their choices would linger long after. Elowen's strength began to fade like the last light of a setting sun, her once vibrant energy now a quiet ember. She could no longer ignore the toll her years as the village's protector had taken. Yet, even in her frailty, her spirit burned with purpose. She called Kael to her side, her voice steady despite the weariness in her eyes. "The time has come," she said, her words carrying the weight of a legacy. "The village will need you to stand where I once stood. But remember, Kael, true power lies not in strength alone, but in balance and humility. These are the lessons that will guide you." Kael listened, his heart heavy with the responsibility she placed upon him. He had always admired her wisdom, her ability to remain calm in the face of danger. But now, as he sat beside her, he felt the enormity of what she was asking. Could he ever live up to her legacy? The doubts gnawed at him, but Alowen's unwavering belief in his potential was a steadying force. "You are ready," she assured him, her voice gentle yet firm. "Trust in yourself as I trust in you." Before he could fully process her words, the village's peace was shattered once more. The rogue enchanters had returned, their dark magic stronger and more menacing than before. The air crackled with tension as Kael rallied the villagers, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. He could feel the weight of Elowen's lessons pressing on him, reminding him of the balance she had spoken of. The battle erupted in a storm of light and shadow, magic clashing against magic. Kael stood at the forefront, drawing upon the ancient power of the tree, its energy flowing through him like a river. He fought not just with strength, but with the wisdom Alowen had imparted, knowing when to strike and when to hold back, when to lead and when to listen. The villagers, inspired by his courage, fought alongside him with renewed determination. Though the rogue enchanters were forced to retreat, the victory felt bittersweet. Kael knew this was only the beginning. The conflict was far from over, and the challenges ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But as he stood amidst the aftermath, the faint rustle of the tree's leaves seemed to whisper Alowen's final lesson. True strength is not just in winning battles, but in carrying the weight of responsibility with grace and humility. And in that moment, Kael felt a quiet resolve settle within him, a spark of hope that he could rise to meet the challenges ahead. The village lay in ruins, but Kael knew it was only the beginning of a greater challenge. With the ancient tree's energy coursing through him, he knelt in the charred soil, pressing his palms to the earth. A soft, golden glow spread from his fingertips, weaving through the ground like threads of light. The land, once barren and lifeless, began to stir. Shoots of grass pushed through the ash, and saplings rose where fallen trees had been. The villagers watched in awe as the forest whispered back to life, its heartbeat returning in time with Kael's own. But Kael understood that restoring the land was only part of the task. The rogue enchanters still posed a threat, their shadows lingering at the edges of the village. He knew he couldn't face them alone. Gathering his courage, he set out to the neighboring villages, seeking allies among those who had once feared the magic of the forest. At first, the villagers were hesitant, their memories of the rogue Enchanter's chaos still fresh. Yet, as Kael spoke of unity and shared purpose, they began to see the strength in standing together. One by one, they joined him, their resolve hardening like roots entwining beneath the soil. As the alliances grew, so did the tree's influence. Its branches stretched further, its leaves shimmering with an otherworldly light. Kael could feel its power pulsing through him, a constant reminder of the delicate balance he was tasked to uphold. But with each passing day, he grew more wary. The tree's energy was intoxicating, its whispers tempting him to rely on it entirely. He knew that such reliance could lead to the same corruption that had claimed the shadowy figure. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kael felt an unexplainable pull deep within the forest. Following the sensation, he came upon a hidden chamber beneath the tree's roots. The air was thick with the scent of earth and ancient magic. Inside, he found a collection of weathered texts, their pages filled with symbols and scripts he had never seen before. As he began to decipher them, a story unfolded, one of a guardian who had once stood at the heart of the magical weave, tasked with preserving the balance of all things. But fear had consumed them, a fear of losing control, of failing in their duty. That fear had twisted their magic, turning it into something dark and destructive. Kael's breath caught as he realized the truth. The tree wasn't just a source of power, it was a manifestation of that guardian's fear, a living reminder of what could happen if he allowed his own doubts to take hold. The shadowy figure he had encountered was not an enemy to be defeated, but a warning, a mirror reflecting the consequences of unchecked fear. To truly restore balance, Kael would have to confront not only the rogue enchanters, but also the darkness within himself. The weight of this revelation settled over him, but it also brought clarity. He knew what he had to do. The tree's energy could help him, but it could not lead him. The path forward would require more than magic. It would demand courage, humility, and an unwavering commitment to the balance he had vowed to protect. And so, with the ancient texts in hand and the forest's whispers at his back, Kael prepared to face the final challenge, knowing that the fate of the land, and perhaps his own soul, depended on his choices. As Kael stepped deeper into the heart of the ancient tree, the air grew heavy with a strange, almost electric energy. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the tree itself were alive, breathing in time with his own heartbeat. Shadows flickered around him, shifting and twisting into shapes that seemed to whisper his name. And then, there it was, the shadowy figure, its form barely holding together, a swirling mass of darkness and light. Its voice echoed in Kael's mind, smooth and seductive, offering him visions of power beyond imagination. "Imagine what you could achieve," it murmured, painting pictures of a world where Kael stood above all, untouchable, unstoppable. The temptation was real, almost overwhelming, but then he felt it, the warmth of Elowen's teachings, her voice steady in his memory. "True strength isn't about control," she had said. "It's about understanding what you cannot control and finding peace within it." Kael closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. He saw the shadow for what it truly was, not just a being of darkness, but a reflection of his own fears, his own insecurities. The figure's desperate need for control mirrored his own struggles, the doubts that had haunted him since he first discovered his magic. For so long, he had tried to be perfect, to hide his flaws, but now he understood. Perfection wasn't the goal. It was the acceptance of imperfection, the courage to be vulnerable that made him strong. With that realization, he stood tall, his voice steady as he spoke. "I don't need your power. I have everything I need already." The shadow recoiled, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The whispers grew faint, then silent, and the air around him grew lighter, clearer. The tree's energy, once chaotic and unstable, began to calm, its pulsing rhythm steadying into a gentle, harmonious hum. Kael took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. He had faced his fears not by conquering them, but by embracing them. And as he stepped out of the tree, the sunlight warm on his face, he felt something new, a quiet confidence, a readiness to lead not from a place of perfection, but from a place of understanding. The village would need him now, more than ever, and for the first time, he knew he was ready. As the seasons turned and the land began to heal, Kael knew that unity would be the key to lasting peace. Gathering the most skilled and wise enchanters from every village, he formed a council, a body of individuals dedicated to preserving the delicate balance between magic and nature. Together, they crafted a shared vision, one that emphasized cooperation over conflict and harmony over dominance. This council became the heart of their new world, a place where differences were celebrated and disputes were resolved through dialogue rather than force. The tree, now towering and radiant, stood as a beacon of hope, its branches stretching far and wide, a living symbol of the unity they had fought so hard to achieve. Kael's days were filled with purpose. He spent hours in the shade of the great tree, teaching the next generation of enchanters the lessons he had learned from Alowen. Her wisdom flowed through him like a river, and he passed it on with patience and care. The young enchanters listened with wide eyes, their hands eager to shape the magic that would one day sustain their world. Kael's teachings were not just about spells and incantations. They were about responsibility, humility, and the importance of listening to the whispers of the earth. He reminded them that magic was not a tool for power, but a gift to be nurtured and protected. Meanwhile, the rogue enchanters, once a formidable threat, began to scatter. Without their leader, their ranks fractured, and many turned away from their destructive path. Some sought redemption, approaching Kael with stories of regret and a desire to make amends. He welcomed them cautiously, offering guidance rather than judgment. He understood that true balance required not only strength, but also compassion. Even as the land flourished, Kael remained watchful, knowing that the struggle for harmony was never truly over. In a quiet moment, Kael knelt by the base of the great tree, a single seed cradled in his hands. It was a small thing, fragile and unassuming, yet it carried within it the promise of renewal. He planted it carefully, whispering words of blessing as he covered it with soil. This act, simple yet profound, marked the completion of his journey. The cycle of magic would continue, each generation building on the legacy of those who came before. The land thrived, alive with the hum of life and magic, but Kael's heart remained steadfast. He knew that balance was not a destination, but a constant, ever-shifting dance, one he would dedicate his life to preserving. The air crackled with tension as Kael stood at the edge of the forest, the rogue enchanters closing in around him. Their eyes glinted with a dangerous hunger, their hands crackling with raw, unchecked magic. They spoke in low, persuasive tones, their voices weaving promises of power that could reshape the world. Join us, they urged, and you'll wield magic beyond your wildest dreams. The balance you cling to is a cage, Kael. Break free, and together we'll rule. For a fleeting moment, the offer hung in the air like a shimmering mirage, tempting and deceptive. But Kael's resolve never wavered. He thought of the ancient tree, its roots deep and unwavering, its purpose clear. He thought of the villagers, their lives intertwined with the delicate harmony he'd sworn to protect. No, he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. Power without balance is chaos. I won't betray what I stand for. The rogue enchanters' expressions darkened, their patience snapping like a brittle twig. Without warning, they unleashed a torrent of chaotic energy, their attacks erupting like violent storms. Kael raised his hands, calling upon the ancient tree's energy. The air around him shimmered as a barrier of pure, radiant magic formed, a protective dome encircling the village. The force of the rogue enchanter's spells crashed against it, sending shockwaves rippling through the air. Kael gritted his teeth, his body trembling under the strain. The tree's energy flowed through him, a river of light and power, but it demanded everything he had. Every breath felt heavier, every heartbeat slower, as if the very essence of life was being drawn from him. Yet he held firm, his determination unyielding. The barrier held unbroken and impenetrable. As the rogue enchanter's attacks grew weaker, their frustration turned to desperation. They shouted, hurling curses and threats, but their magic faltered. One by one, they began to retreat, their once menacing presence dissolving into the shadows. Kael watched them go, his vision blurring, his strength nearly spent. When the last of them vanished, the barrier shimmered and faded, its purpose fulfilled. Kael's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, his body spent but his spirit soaring. Around him, the villagers emerged from their homes, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. Cheers erupted, a chorus of relief and celebration, but Kael's mind was elsewhere. He gazed at the ancient tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, and felt a profound connection to its timeless wisdom. This victory was not the end, he realized. It was a step forward, a reminder that the path of balance was never easy, but always worth it. And though his body ached and his energy was drained, Kael knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next. Kael stood at the edge of the village, where the ancient tree's branches reached skyward, their leaves shimmering with a soft, golden light. It was here, beneath its shadow, that he felt closest to Alowen. The weight of his journey pressed on him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far he had come. Once a wanderer, skeptical of magic and its purpose, he now stood as the village's protector, a role he had never imagined for himself. He knelt by her grave, the stone cool beneath his fingertips. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "for showing me that magic isn't just power, it's responsibility." its connection. The wind stirred, rustling the leaves above, and for a moment it felt as though she were there, her presence as warm and reassuring as the sunlight filtering through the branches. The tree, once a symbol of Elowen's hidden strength, now stood as a testament to their shared legacy. Its roots ran deep, anchoring the village in a harmony that had seemed impossible when Kael first arrived. The magic that flowed through it was alive, a gentle pulse that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the land itself. It was a reminder that even in loss, there was growth. Even in endings, there were beginnings. As Kael rose, his gaze shifted to the horizon, where the sky met the distant hills. The village behind him thrived, its people living in peace, their laughter a melody that carried on the breeze. But beyond those hills lay a world still shrouded in uncertainty. Magic, though a force for good here, was not always understood or welcomed elsewhere. Kael knew his work was far from over. He tightened his grip on his staff, the weight of it familiar and grounding. "I'll continue what you started," he said softly, his words carrying the weight of a vow. Not just for the village, but for the world. Magic should be a gift, not a weapon, and I'll do everything I can to keep it that way. The story of Kael and Alowen was one of transformation, of finding purpose in the unlikeliest of places, and of understanding that true strength lies in connection and compassion. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, Kael took a deep breath, the air filled with the scent of earth and blossoms. There was hope, yes, but also the quiet acknowledgement that balance was not a destination. It was a journey, one that required vigilance, courage, and an unyielding belief in the good that magic could bring. With one last glance at the tree, Kael turned and walked toward the horizon, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The village would always be his home, but the world beyond called to him, its mysteries and challenges waiting to be met. And as he stepped forward, the magic within him hummed softly, a reminder that he was never truly alone.